Hi guys, when it comes to this channel, people really seem to like the comparison videos, so here comes another one at your face. Check out these two side-by-side clips of our gorgeous model here in Handsome Alley. Now, these two clips were taken at the most popular focal length, or at least arguably the most popular focal length when it comes to full-frame video. But one of those clips is from a $748 lens, this one right here, and the other clip was from a $199 lens. Could you see a difference? Maybe, but we should still talk about it. So as many of you are aware, third-party manufacturers are getting better and better at making glass, especially when it comes to autofocus lenses. Lately, we have had a plethora of autofocus lenses giving us some nice budget options to the big boys. If you are a Sony shooter, you are really in a good situation right now. But that first clip that I showed you, one of those lenses is from a native Sony lens. The $748 lens that I was talking about was this 35 1.8. And let's put that clip back up. The other lens, $199 Meike lens. The Meike lens is an f2.0, so not all the way down to 1.8, but it is really hard to tell much of a difference in terms of background separation from 1.8 to 2. So we are talking about full frame lenses right now, and when you look at a full frame Sony native lens, $748 is actually not that expensive relative to the system. And this thing actually punches above its price point of $748. I saw no reason whatsoever to buy the G Master version 1 35mm when this one was out. In my opinion, this thing outperformed that GM in almost every way, certainly that counted for me. However, to have a 35mm full frame f2.0 lens for $199, that is something certainly. And you can see the image quality, it competes at least in that particular test. And if you are looking for a 35mm lens on a budget for video, then this guy certainly might do the trick. But let's get into the nitty-gritty and see how it competes with this lens, which I love very much. Let's see how it competes overall. Before we go any further, I'd like to put up another side-by-side of my pretty face, because number one, I like just looking at myself, and number two, the 35mm focal length is very popular for a situation like this. A talking head scenario, a lot of people like to use a 35mm. If they're doing documentaries, they're doing interviews, 35mm is almost always in the bag of those types of people. So as you can see, both lenses do a great job here in the studio. The camera is about 6 or 7 feet away from me, so that is the type of room you're going to need if you want to get a shot like this. A lot of people also love a 35mm when it comes to photos. It's not so wide that it distorts your subject, but it is wide enough to get a decent field of view. A lot of people really like it for things like street photography and travel photography, so we will talk about all of that. And of course, I should mention that Meike did send me this lens out for the purpose of this review at no cost to myself, but they don't get to see this video before you do. No money changed hands, and I have a great relationship with Sony as well. I don't really care which lens you buy. I just want to give you a bunch of options, show you the tests, and see which one you prefer. So first, let's talk about the build quality of the Meike lens. It is an all-plastic lens. It is a lightweight plastic with a plastic smooth turning focus ring. It has an autofocus to manual focus switch, 58mm filter thread, and on the back it has a USB-C port for updating and a nice bright red rubber gasket for a little bit of weather sealing. It comes with a decent petal lens hood, not the best I've ever seen, but certainly adequate for a lens that is $199. The Sony lens is actually much smaller and a little bit lighter. It is 279 grams compared to the 301 grams of the Meike lens. But the Sony lens is made mostly of metal, and I actually really like that. The new Sony lenses, even the G Masters, are a very hard plastic. They're trying to keep the weight down, but I really love the feel of these older metal lenses that Sony produced. A very smooth turning focus ring. It has an autofocus to manual focus switch and a focus hold button. It has a 55mm filter thread and no rubber weather sealing gasket on the back. The Sony lens also comes with a premium petal lens hood, which feels very solid. So out of the two lenses, I definitely prefer the Sony in terms of the build quality. It feels very premium. It is smaller, it is lighter, it has a focus hold button, and I don't hate this Meike lens. It is a fine build quality. It's a really, really good one on this Sony lens. When it comes to sharpness, the Sony is sharper across the board. In the center, it is sharper, and in the corners, it is sharper. The Meike is still a sharp lens, and that is impressive, but the Sony is just a hair sharper when it comes to the entire frame. Even down at 1.8, the Sony is a little bit sharper than the Meike at f2. Now, when you stop down the lenses, the Meike catches up about right around f4. So if you want to do a lot of landscapes, things like that, you're often shooting at f8 anyway. And if you're doing that, then you will find both lenses are really about the same. I should also mention that you will see in the test photos that Sony has brighter corners because the Sony has a Lightroom profile that can correct for its darker corners, whereas as of right now, the Meike lens does not have a Lightroom profile. So Meike, if you are watching this, and I don't know why you wouldn't be, I'm a total delight, please include a Lightroom profile at least on your website so that we can download it and put it into Lightroom and fix those darker corners. They're not too dark, it's always nice to have a Lightroom profile. Let's talk about autofocus. And the great news here is that the Meike does a really good job when it comes to autofocus. You know the Sony is going to do a great job when it comes to autofocus, and it does. It's lightning fast, it's very sticky. But the Meike lens, this is also doing a really good job, and that's very impressive. This company has just started making autofocus lenses, and the focus is pretty much dead silent, very snappy and quick without any kind of pulsing or hesitation. Whether you are an AFC, AFS, if you're tracking, it still does a really great job, and that is something that counts for a whole lot. When it comes to focus breathing, the Sony wins here in two ways. Number one, it really doesn't have much focus breathing at all. This 35mm, that's one of the reasons I preferred it over the 35mm G Master version 1, is that G Master had a lot of focus breathing, whereas this 35 has very, very little. You can also turn on focus breathing compensation in your newer Sony cameras if you want none at all, but honestly, it really doesn't make a difference because this thing has minimal to no focus breathing. There is a moderate amount of focus breathing on the Meike 35. It is not horrendous, but it is something that you might notice if you were doing long focus pulls in video or you're trying to do focus stacking with your photos. With talking head shots like this or interviews, you're really not going to have much of an issue with focus breathing. It's only when you're doing long focus throws. When it comes to chromatic aberration, both lenses do a really excellent job. You can have a backlit subject, you can raise your shadows, and there is really no chromatic aberration to speak of. So great job from both companies in that regard. And when it comes to LOCA, we also have good news. LOCA is longitudinal chromatic aberration. That is the color fringing you will see on areas that are out of focus in the foreground and the background. That is hard to remove in post, but both lenses do a really good job of controlling the LOCA. Down at 1.8 on the Sony, you can see some for sure, but it is really not too bad. And at f2, both lenses at f2, there is hardly any LOCA, which is very impressive. And if you stop it down any further, it is completely gone. So great job for the LOCA. With minimum focus distance, we have a big win for the Sony here. The Sony can focus as close as 22 centimeters, so you can get pretty close to your subject and really blow out that background, whereas the Meike lens, you have to get about 45 centimeters away to get something in focus. So that is a drastic difference. If you like to do a lot of close-up photography or videography, then the Sony is definitely going to be the way to go. The bokeh on both lenses is really great, and it's kind of hard to distinguish between the two in that regard. It looks wonderful, it looks creamy and smooth back there, even if the background is pretty busy. Nothing is distracting. I really like the bokeh that is coming out of both of these lenses. When it comes to the bokeh balls, and I'm going to say this entire thing with a straight face, the Sony has nicer balls in my opinion. They are a bit rounder, and they certainly get a lot bigger. Bigger, rounder balls, because you can focus this one so much closer at that minimum focus distance. You can really blow up the balls in your photos, but it's the shape really that you're concerned with in this particular test. And the shape of the Sony is a little bit nicer. You can see the outline of the aperture blades a little bit more with the Meike, but they're still nice and clean. They are pretty round. I do like the bokeh balls coming out of this. It's just the Sony ones are a tad nicer. See, I'm totally mature. Sunstars are a bit of a mixed bag here. The Meike has more dramatic Sunstars. They are bigger, but the Sony ones are neater. So the photo looks a little more clean and it has less sun spilling all over the place. It's up to you which one you prefer, but you will see a little less flaring as well on the Sony lens. When it comes to glare and ghosting, both lenses do a pretty good job of keeping contrast even in very backlit situations. But once in a while, I did notice a problem with the Meike lens if I wasn't using my lens hood. If I had the sun in the sky and it hit it at a certain angle, I could get a little bit less contrast. I could wash out my image a little more with the Meike lens. So you see in this example here how the Sony keeps the contrast and the sharpness much more because it doesn't have that same issue. So with the Meike lens, you're going to shoot in sun, leave that hood on for sure. So what have we learned here? If you're like me, you find learning mighty difficult. But what we've learned is that this Sony 35mm f1.8 is still a fantastic lens in 2024. $748 is not cheap, but this is an excellent lens. And the Meike lens, you know, even though the Sony lens is better than it in pretty much every way, this thing's $199, and as you see, it is a solid performer. So if you want a lens, let's say just for video, and you're gonna have it in a studio, and you wanted to get a 35mm on a budget, here you go. This will be a great option. Or you needed a 35 once in a while or out for street photography. This lens will do you just fine. Now see, this is what I love about having all of these third-party options. You can go with a native Sony glass on a Sony camera and you know you're going to get wonderful results, but you can also get great results with a much lower price lens, and depending on what you're looking for, this really might work for you. Now the company Yongnuo also makes a 35mm f2 just like Meike, and I'm going to get that one in the studio and I'm going to compare it to the Meike lens and to the Sony 35 as well. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know down below, does this Meike float your boat, or would you rather go with the older, fancier Sony lens that will cost you a pretty penny? Let me know down below what you think, and I appreciate you watching this. We'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.